Well, good morning, everyone, and happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings and my segment here on Morning Musings that on Friday I call my Responding to the Critics. And what I do on Fridays is I review books that have been written against preterism and articles, videos, etc., etc. And I was specifically asked to examine this book, The Future of Rome, which in chapter 11, the author by the name of Peter Oakes sets out to prove that Babylon in the book of Revelation was none other than Rome. I categorically disagree with that, and let me remind you that I have written a book on Revelation and the question, who is this Babylon? I am absolutely convinced that Babylon in the book of Revelation is none other than first century Old Covenant Jerusalem. It has nothing to do with Rome as being Babylon. And so I categorically disagree with Mr. Oakes and with other authors who take the same tack. And so I've been examining several of his arguments. I've tried to hit all of the salient and major arguments that he offers. I've shared with you how he simply brushes aside some of the most fundamental facts that are found in the book of Revelation. And I'm going to cover some of those again today. So fair warning, a good deal of what I'm going to share this morning is really recapitulation of what I've shared with you before. But this is found in his concluding comments, so it's appropriate, it's apropos that I do that. Now, in addition to that, I'm going to segue into some points that are made by Andrew Perryman. Andrew Perryman is a really, really good author, and I have engaged him on the internet before. Really, really enjoyed our exchange. I'll share with you some of his arguments on, and he wrote an article, and this was way back. Let me see. 2015. I believe that's about the time that he and I engaged in an exchange. So it's been a good little while back. But he wrote an article entitled 20 Reasons for Thinking That Babylon the Great is Rome, Not Jerusalem. I'm not going to hit every single argument that he makes because he makes some of the identical arguments that Mr. Oakes does in the future of Rome. So there's no need for me to hit those. But I am going to hit a couple of them. Because I think that they need to be addressed. Okay, in The Future of Rome, on page 225, in his in his paragraph entitled Conclusion, Reappropriating Prophetic Resources for Displaying the Destruction of Rome. Now, that title alone is really revealing. Now, I'm going to say that on a scale of 1 to 10, I would agree with Mr. Oakes, maybe on a point of 1 to 1.5. And let me explain that, all right? But let me read to you part of what he says here. Eric Gruen shows that even the Jewish Sibylline oracles, now those are some ancient writings that had to do with, and they wrote a good bit. Some of the Sibylline oracles talked about the past fulfillment of Jerusalem, and some of them foretold the destruction of Rome. And what you have to understand is that many of these were written from a distinctively Jewish perspective. Now, some scholars believe that there are Christian interpolations in the Sibylline oracles. Well, okay, but not in the sections that I'm concerned with. Anyway, Eric Gruen shows that even the Jewish Sibylline oracles are framed primarily in terms of their non-Jewish precursors. So, supposedly, according to this one scholar, the Sibylline oracles are drawing on non-Jewish sources. Well, that should raise a red flag with us, because certainly non-Jewish sources would have a totally different perspective from Jewish sources. But I want to go one step further. Jewish sources would have a distinctively different perspective from Christian sources. Let me illustrate that. Many scholars point out that after the fall of Jerusalem, and by the way, I developed this subject a good bit in this book, all right? And if you'll order the book through my website, donkpreston.com, and if you'll send me a note that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, I'll refund your shipping. That'll save you $7 plus. So anyway, I point out that many scholars take note of the fact that Rome, after the fall of Jerusalem, okay? Let me reiterate this. Let me drive this home. You have to catch the power of what I'm about to say. After the fall of Rome, many ancient Jewish sources call Rome Babylon. Why did they do that? Well, because Rome destroyed Jerusalem, just like ancient Babylon. Rome took Jews into captivity, just like ancient Babylon. But here's the problem. Many scholars, focusing in on the post-AD 70, post-destruction of Jerusalem, they take note of the fact of how Jewish rabbis were calling Rome Babylon, and they say, see, this proves that Babylon in the book of Revelation was in fact Rome. Now they're coupling their argument with the presupposition, the assumption that Revelation was written after the fall of Rome, just like these other Jewish writings. Well, there are an awful lot of assumptions going on here, ladies and gentlemen. Number one, you are lifting citations and quotes and writings from post-AD 70 writers who are concerned with the past destruction of Jerusalem. Number two, you are ignoring the internal evidence of the book of Revelation and then extrapolating and projecting your view of the post-70 writings back onto the book of Revelation. Or in the insistence that Revelation was written post-AD 70, then they say, see, we have rabbinic writings calling Rome Babylon, and we have Revelation post-AD 70, and they're all using the term Babylon. Babylon must be Rome. That's a little bit of circular reasoning going on here. Now, Mr. Oakes, citing Eric Gruen, says there are overlaps with the sibling, for instance, in the role of Nero in the destruction of fire. However, John basically draws on the scriptural prophets. In particular, he draws on the prophetic depictions of cities that are seen as wicked, especially Babylon and Tyre. Boy, there's a lot to unpack right there. There really is. There's an awful lot to unpack here, but let me keep this just as brief as I can. Number one, Mr. Gruen says there's some inconsistencies, there's some incongruities between what John does in Revelation and the scriptural testimony, the actual scriptural testimony. But he says there are some incongruities with the Sibylline oracles as well. This is where I would agree. Because the Sibylline oracles were written after the fall of Jerusalem. And in some of their writings, some of those oracles, they are emphatically predicting the destruction of Rome. In other words, there's absolutely no way you can miss the point in those post-AD 70 Sibylline oracles. But we don't find that kind of testimony in the book of Revelation. Therefore, there is a disconnect. To try to draw direct parallels between the Sibylline oracles and the book of Revelation. But you see, once again, Mr. Oakes is, like most commentators, taking it for granted that the book of Revelation was written after AD 70. He is then projecting that in comparison with, as a parallel to the Sibylline oracles. That's anachronism. It's presumptive. But then we really kind of get down to part of the meat of the matter here. John basically draws on the scriptural prophets. In other words, he's not drawing from the Sibylline oracles. Well, yeah, because they were written after him. He couldn't draw on them. And Mr. Gruen, just like Mr. Oakes, agrees that John is drawing on the scriptures, all of which were written prior to AD 70. He's drawing on the Old Testament, which was written hundreds upon hundreds of years prior to AD 70. But then he makes this amazing statement. John basically draws on the scriptural prophets. In particular, he draws on the prophetic depiction of cities that are seen as wicked, especially Babylon and Tyre. That's true. But Mr. Oakes does something really strange, something inconsistent. He goes, well, okay, John draws on Isaiah and Jeremiah, which were clearly predicting the fall of ancient Babylon. So John is drawing on those Old Testament passages. Therefore, Babylon in Revelation is Rome. Excuse me. Yeah, I thought I had that on mute. Yeah, sorry about that, folks. Give me just a second here and I'll turn this thing off so it won't happen again. I'm not going to restart my video, okay? Life happens. Okay, see, what Mr. Oakes is doing, once again, to reiterate, since being so rudely interrupted, since Mr. Oakes says, okay, John in Revelation draws on Isaiah and Jeremiah in their predictions of the destruction of Babylon. Since John is drawing on Old Testament predictions of the destruction of Babylon, that must mean that John is using the imagery of Babylon to speak of Rome. Okay, well, then he repeats and says, as I've already pointed this out, but it's important to get it in front of us again. He points out that, okay, in Ezekiel predicted the fall of Tyre. John draws on Ezekiel. But does Mr. Oakes say, well, John draws on Ezekiel, which predicted the fall of Tyre, therefore Babylon was Tyre? No. He says, John draws on the language of the destruction of Tyre, therefore Babylon in Revelation was Rome. You see what he's done here? And then, of course, in spite of the fact that John in Revelation likewise draws on multiple Old Testament prophecies about the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, in spite of the fact that Mr. Oakes acknowledges that, he essentially goes, well, yes, it's true that John draws on Old Testament passages that foretold the destruction of Jerusalem, but that means that Babylon in Revelation was Rome. Now, folks, if you want to see an inconsistency here, this is it. So on the one hand, John draws on Old Testament prophecies of the destruction of Babylon. That's got to be Rome. John draws on Old Testament language concerning the destruction of Tyre. That means Babylon in Revelation had to be Rome, not Tyre, Rome. And even though John draws on Old Testament prophecies concerning the destruction of Jerusalem, that must mean that John's talking about Rome. I'm sorry, there's a total logical disconnect between all of this. Furthermore, it overlooks something that's very, very critical. Now, does John draw on Old Testament predictions, draw on the language of the destruction of Babylon and Tyre? He certainly does. But you see, there's not a one-to-one equivalency here. John is using those examples of the destruction of the enemies of God, but he then refines his references by pointing out several things. And I would point out that John draws on Jesus's prosaic, non-metaphoric, non-literal language, and Jesus had a 5-point narrative. Number one, it was Old Covenant Jerusalem that killed the prophets. Babylon of Revelation killed the prophets. Number two, Old Covenant Jerusalem would kill Jesus, would kill him. Matthew 21. Book of Revelation, Babylon is, quote, where the Lord was crucified. Revelation 11:8. Number three, Babylon is the city guilty of killing the apostles and prophets of Jesus. Jesus said it was Old Covenant Jerusalem, and only Old Covenant Jerusalem, that would be guilty of killing his apostles, prophets, and wise men that he would send to them. Okay? Prophets, Jesus's apostles and prophets. Jesus taught that in the killing of the prophets, of him and his apostles and prophets, Old Covenant Jerusalem would fill up the measure of her sin in his generation. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 6. John says he saw Babylon, the great harlot, holding a golden cup full of the blood of the martyrs and of the saints. Her cup of sin was full. Point number 5, Jesus said the judgment of Old Covenant Jerusalem for killing the prophets, killing him, killing his apostles and prophets, of filling up the measure of their sin, judgment would fall on her in that generation. Matthew 23:36 and following. And John was told that the judgment of Babylon was at hand, coming soon, coming shortly, coming quickly. Now you see what John is doing. He is drawing on Jesus. By the way, he's also drawing on Paul, who uses that same 5-point narrative. And we're supposed to believe that because John in Revelation draws on Isaiah and Jeremiah, which predicted the destruction of a pagan city, that must mean it's Rome in the book of Revelation. Because John draws on the Old Testament prophecies of the destruction of Tyre as a pagan city, that must mean that John is referring to Babylon as Rome, the pagan city. Folks, that doesn't follow at all. Let me point out to you that world-renowned scholars such as N.T. Wright, R.T. France, Scott McKnight, Andrew Perriman, and others understand and realize, and they're on record of this. If anyone wants a citation of it, just contact me. I'll be glad to give you, I'll be glad to give you the direct citation. All right? But all of these scholars recognize that in Jesus' teaching, in John's teaching, throughout the New Testament writers draw on prophecies that were predictions of the destruction of pagan nations, but they apply those prophecies, catch this, please catch the power of this. They apply those Old Testament prophecies of the destruction of pagan nations to the impending destruction of Old Covenant Jerusalem. In other words, as N.T. Wright expresses it, Jerusalem, by the way, R.T. France says the same thing, Jerusalem has become the equivalent of a pagan entity, a pagan city. And she, just like those Old Testament pagans of the Old Testament because she has become the enemy of God. And yes, that's what happened to Old Covenant Jerusalem. She became the enemy of God. All you have to do is read the book of Lamentations as Jeremiah laments how Jerusalem of the 6th century AD had become the enemy of God, and how John in Revelation is drawing on the book of Lamentations. Jerusalem of John's day had become the enemy of God. Paul's explicit about it. In Philippians chapter 3, as he addresses the problem of the Jews attacking the Christians and the Judaizers imposing the old law on Christians. And Paul says, there are many of whom I am speaking, and I write to you even now in tears. They worship their God is their belly. And I tell you now, even weeping, they are the enemies of Christ. In the book of Revelation, you have the synagogue of Satan twice, Revelation 2:9, Revelation 3:9 and 10. Those who say they are Jews, but they are not. They are the synagogue of Satan. They say they are Jews, but they are not, for they are liars. And they're going to cast Christians into prison. Do you suppose that means they are the enemies of Christ? Yeah. In the book of Revelation, Satan, the devil, is the great persecutor. Who is the great persecutor in the book of Revelation? Well, once again, it's this great city Babylon that killed the prophets. And remember, Jesus identified Jerusalem as the only city he ever identified as the city guilty of killing the prophets was Jerusalem. Once again, it's the city where the Lord was crucified. That could only be one city, ladies and gentlemen. No other city could identify as the city where the Lord was crucified. And you can write articles entitled, Babylon was any city in every city, and it becomes absolutely ridiculous in the sight of the fact that Babylon of Revelation is, quote, where the Lord was crucified. The Lord was not crucified in any city in every city. He was crucified in one city. No other, one city. And of course, again, Babylon was not any city in every city that killed the apostles and the prophets of Jesus. Only one city, ladies and gentlemen, became the enemy of God by persecuting God's saints. Only one. That's Old Covenant Jerusalem. Jesus and the New Testament writers invariably lay the blame for the persecution of the martyrs, the saints of Christ, the saints of both Old Covenant and New. They lay that full guilt at the foot of Jerusalem, nowhere else. And thus, Mr. Oakes, in his admission that John basically draws on the scriptural prophets, in particular, he draws on the prophetic depictions of cities that are seen as wicked, especially Babylon and Tyre. Well, he's correct in that, but he overlooks the fact that John, in the book of Revelation, is telling us that this Babylon, the city that killed the prophets and Jesus and, etc., is taking the place, acting like the pagan enemies of God. And becoming a pagan enemy of God meant that Babylon, i.e. Jerusalem, was doomed to destruction. Well, I don't have time to get into Andrew Perriman's article and his reasons for saying 20 reasons, I think, is that right? Yeah. 20 reasons for thinking that Babylon the Great is Rome, not Jerusalem. So, I have finished with the review of this, The Future of Rome, and Mr. Oakes' chapter on that. I appreciate the good comments I've received from many of you, and I will segue from Mr. Oakes to Andrew Perriman. And like I said, I really appreciate Andrew Perriman. He's done some really, really good writing. His book, The Parousia of the Son of Man, outstanding in many, many ways. It's one of those books that you can read and go, he's got to be a preterist. Really, honestly, you think that. But nonetheless, he strives mightily to avoid what I consider to be the logical implications of his own writings. Okay? Thank you for joining me for this morning's morning musings and responding to the critics. Don't forget, go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. Go to the store, order yourself a copy of Who Is This Babylon? And by the way, as you read the book, you are going to see that I respond to, either directly or indirectly, to everything that Mr. Oakes said, as well as what Andrew Perriman said all the way back in 2015. Okay? Be sure to send me a note that says you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping. Going to save you a nice bit of change. All right? Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you tonight on Preterist Apologetics with Mike Sullivan and myself as we continue our study of the Song of Moses as the foundation for all biblical eschatology. It is great stuff. See you there.